welcome back to Spotlights, the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week we have the second part of our two-part interview with Celina Osuna, a writer, artist, and scholar working with the desert humanities. So I'll hand it over to her so she can define for us exactly what desert humanities means.
Something like defining desert humanities is now something I'm having to do pretty regularly. Had to do it in the book a little bit. And that's hard because, well, there have been people doing that kind of work. Do you consider indigenous peoples? They've been doing that kind of work for millennia. Right. So, for me to come along and like be at the forefront of desert humanity, like it's problematic, right? It's problematic, but then it's also, that's what the structure of the academy is built upon. Like that's how we then kind of label what we do so that people know where to go to talk to other people.
Yeah, we have to have labels. That's the thing. Like we need a label and you're like, well, it's not going to fit on a label. They're like, give me the label.
And it's a weird thing to embrace it while understanding that it is just because you're the one who named it, right? Like right. This is the colonial project, like, just because Eddie Izzard has a really famous bit where he goes, he's talking about the British going, might have been India, it's like, we own this land now, and they're like, no, you don't, we've been here. He's like, well, do you have a flag? And they're like, well, we have a flag, here you go. So like, it's kind of, it feels a little bit like that to claim a place like that, but I also think then, okay, well then it's even more important to be mindful and thoughtful about how you're doing that.
Yeah, exactly, right. Well, that was was that your definition of desert humanities?
No, it wasn't. That was my definition of how to define a field, when that defining a field is fraught territory because it's right. Going to change, right? Like it just will change. It's going to change. And you also know to put a label on something that's been happening is strange, but in this way, like, environmental humanities has gotten huge, right? And it's like, well, lots of things can now retroactively be environmental humanities.
Yeah, that's such an important point, because I've heard that critique a lot from environmental humanities kind of stuff, is like you're making it seem like you're inventing this thing that people have been doing. And especially when you're talking about like indigenous people, and it's like, well, and the colonial project, it's just basically stolen. And then you're like, well, maybe I'll get a professorship out of this. And like, oh, that's not doing this right at all. So I really appreciate that is an important caveat for how to define things. That, I don't know, if you're defining chemistry even and things like that, you have to acknowledge like, well, there's a history here. And, I'm not necessarily in charge with the authority to define it. And yet you're, the assistant director of a desert humanities initiative. So if anybody's in charge, people are going to come up to you and like, all right, give me in one sentence, what is it? Right. So how do you define desert humanities? Doesn't have to be a sentence. It could be a paragraph.
I think the sentence that's written now talks about like the flourishings of different kinds of like desert thinking and dwelling. And I think that that's right. And so honestly, desert humanities evolves as the more I think about it. For example, we had an event that I got to moderate with 3 different faculty from Arizona State University, and it was based on desert water. And so, like, just because you're talking about the desert doesn't mean A, that you have to talk about water, or B, that you don't have to talk about water. Right. But it was because there's both, right? Like there's extractive ecologies studies out there that talk about water and extraction, and specifically in desert places. But then there's also, I think, the side I've been on for the longest is like, well, there's tons of water studies out there. Let me do everything else. But this was an interesting discussion because we had a social scientist who's, had actual data and did actual field work, which, in our realm of the humanities at ASU, we don't always have. So that was amazing. And then we had a scholar kind of interpreting like Italian poetry, and desert as kind of as a metaphor for a city and for a place. And then we had a religious studies scholar, Jason Bruner, who was talking about, you know, everything from getting his backyard into shape for like the desert heat, to understanding the importance of moisture for life in arid spaces. And so it was this really amazing combination of voices and of scholarship. And I think my own vision and goal for something like Desert Humanities looks like I might live here, like I might have to, and I don't mean here in a desert, I mean I might live in Desert Humanities for the rest of my days, and I'll be very content. But it doesn't mean that to do it, you have to live in that field. I think just any kinds of critical engagements, artistic engagements with desert places and anything from the cultures and peoples to the flora and fauna is really enough for me in my book to be like, this is Desert Humanities. Like I'm maybe less discerning in that way. I think I don't want to have that boundary up of like, you don't live here, you're not from here, you can't do it. That's, to me, that is counterproductive. But I do at the same time kind of hope that we can start to recognize that a lot of the loudest voices in desert scholarship, but also in pop culture, have been people who are not from deserts, who were fascinated with deserts and wrote about them poetically, did painting. I mean, Georgia O'Keeffe,
right.
She's synonymous, right, with New Mexico and those landscapes and her watercolors and everything. And like, she wasn't from there, but she died there. She loved it, and she gave us lots of images, right? John Ford, the director of many, many, many a Western. We got a lot of our like shoot 'em up outlaw saloon desert stuff from John Ford. He wasn't from a desert, you know, like, so like I want to acknowledge that those voices have been the loudest and that there are lots of other voices. And so any kind of engagement with those voices, I think, is really important, to appreciating, like I keep saying, the multiplicity of desert places and really the abundance of desert places.
Right. No, I like that a lot. The big tent approach.
Yeah.
Instead of somebody's like, well, no, that's not quite desert humanities. You're just doing cactus humanities, and that's a different thing. Or
I do love cactus humanities. There's a good growing. I'm following on Twitter now a couple people who study specifically cactus, and it is amazing. But yes, it's. I think it's really nice to have many seats at the table, and you know, shine a light specifically on people who haven't historically been at the table because of reasons like stolen land, you know, slavery, and things that people sometimes will overlook when talking about desert places. Like, not to get too heavy, but there was a lot of slavery that happened in the West. There was a lot of slavery of indigenous peoples and Mexican peoples, and
yeah, no, it's just terrible. And what, does Arizona have the most reservation land of any state in the United States?
Pop quiz. I feel like it does, between like Hopi Navajo Nation.
Yeah.
And because a large part of the north of Arizona, for anyone unfamiliar, is Indian reservation land.
Right.
Yeah, their homelands, really. I mean, and you know, we're trying to also save Oak Flat, which is not far from here, maybe like an hour and a half or so outside of Superior, Arizona. I don't know if you know Superior, but there's Apache sacred lands called Oak Flat that are, you would think by now we're not saying this anymore, but they're threatened by mining companies who want to take over their lands. And so that just seems to be on repeat, and especially out here. I mean, especially in places where people think it's empty.
Right.
This is the whole thing. Like, if you've thought that this place is empty this whole time, you've bombed it, you've dug it up, you've extracted resources, you've forced people off their lands, like, because you think no one's here. And yeah, I really hope that that changes. I really, really wish to see the consciousness around that and around deserts change, because once that happens, I do think we'll start to see, I don't know, this taking back, like land back, like we'll start to see, hopefully anyway.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
No, it reminds me of the when Australia was colonized, right? And the whole justification was terra nullius. This is nothing. The land is nothing. And it's like, and there's people, and there's like animals, and there's plants, and there's landscapes,
Yeah.
and they're like, not looks like nothing. We see
Nothing
zero.
here.
That's just
Yeah.
mind blowing. And to think that that attitude is still going on and still being used to justify effectively oppressing people and stealing from them, and genocide,
Yeah.
really. Um,
Totally.
yeah, so I mean, it's such important work, and I think it's one of those things where some people who are like, yeah, I care about fighting for things like this, and they might not see that these social issues are in fact tied to the way we perceive environments, and
Absolutely.
that's we're really environmental humanities. It's like, no, it is the humanities. This is about humans in a lot of ways, but bridging those connections to see that the way we were perceiving humans, the way we're perceiving deserts, are oddly aligned. um,
They're very, very aligned. I
yeah,
mean, when you look at New Mexico and Arizona in particular, and you look at where the mining companies are, right, it tends to be near Indian reservation lands. And so then who's working on them? And so who's being exposed? And these are all environmental justice, which is slightly out of my purview, while in the purview. I'm not, I there's so many amazing scholars that I feel just like it's not my realm. But that is the case, right? And now I mean, with the Colorado River and
right,
Lake Mead, I don't know if you saw Lake Mead's
yeah,
historically low levels and, issues of water rights and everything. Yeah, I mean, I know you know this, but like climate change has been here. Climate change has been here, and I believe that people of color have been just incredibly more affected, and earlier in terms of environmental injustices.
yeah,
I mean, you can go as far back. You can go back 500 years when the
right,
Spaniards were here. You can go back a couple hundred years, right? You you can go to like 50 years ago. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I started a lot of my work on the border, on the U.S. Mexico. I say the border. I'm doing it again. The border. On a border, on the U.S. Mexico border, and I knew this. I grew up in El Paso on the where you could just see Juarez, right? It's hard to even, for me, it's really hard to even think about Juarez and El Paso as separate countries. Like I know that that's logically, I know that's the case, but it's very hard because it's there,
right,
and the flow of people and everything. So I started kind of working on literatures and ideas around this border because it really is just this wondrous and horrific thing that all of a sudden, okay, we followed the river and we followed the land, and now we're claiming this river. Oh no, wait, we're going to claim a little further south, and then there's going to be a war, and then lots of millions of people are suddenly going to find themselves in a nation that's not there. So in 1848, right, like end of US war with Mexico, the border changed. And there's a famous saying, like, we didn't cross the border crossed
right.
us. And it's true, and it's true. And I think about that all the time. Like, you're just where you've been for generations, and then all of a sudden you have a year, 2 years to get gone. And if you make it past all of the other obstacles. So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an interesting and endless thing. I mean, I think that in itself led in my work to thinking about bio and necropolitics, which is that's a whole other building of scholars and thinkers. But thinking about the border and the US Mexico border, and understanding that it's been weaponized.
Yeah.
And it's been weaponized in allyship I don't think desert places are necessarily allies to border patrol, but they certainly, they help, you know, the heat, the extreme heat, the lack of water, and the way that the border patrol have learned to funnel people's, and especially in Arizona, there's a really famous corridor called the Devil's Highway, which I do write about. That's Luis Alberto Urrea has a book called The Devil's Highway that documents that. But there's this, you know, corridor, and they get funneled through that, and the border patrol can either choose to help and detain, or they can just watch the desert heat take effect, right? And all that tiredness, all of that that energy that is now lost, because people are not always coming from Mexico. They are also coming from further south. And I realize this conversation's taken a really heavy turn, but it is important to me, like that also is ongoing. While we have climate change ongoing, we have patrolling of a border ongoing, and that we lose people all the time. We lose people all the time to these. And so, yeah, there's no end. There's no end. I'm sorry, just rambled on. But there is no end to the amount of important issues that desert humanities kind of, for me, can engage itself with, and should in some ways. It always should. And I'm hoping that my own scope of regional will become much broader, and I will be able to, you know, meet and talk to scholars of Australian deserts and scholars of, you know, like African deserts and Asian deserts. But right now I've been regional, but I'm looking to kind of break out a bit. It won't be in this project, but hopefully the next one.
Nice. Oh, that's interesting. I like to think of a kind of planetary perspective on deserts and the great variety. Especially, I mean, we're talking about heat a lot, but I guess some deserts, a high desert, you have some, it gets pretty cold.
Yeah,
Um,
well, tundra.
yeah,
Tundra is desert, right? And it's like, I haven't studied the tundra almost at all. And I know there's people out there that study maybe just the tundra. And
right.
what would those conversations look like, right? And what happens when you start talking to those people, right? And I don't know, the same thing with the blue humanities, right? Like
Right.
that's now emerging, blue humanities, ocean humanities. Like that's where some might see like rivalry of like earth and ground and like, oh, water. I kind of feel like, well, no, like I think there's a lot to be had from those kinds of conversations across those. Like you all, whoever you are, you all study the blue humanities and the oceans, and I feel like I can learn a lot from those ecosystems, and I don't know, and hopefully also contribute something from learning from deserts.
Right, right. Yeah, I think about like, I don't know, in the time since I've been away from Arizona, whenever I go back, there's more golf courses. And they just keep building golf courses. And it's like, well, and they all have lakes. They'll have little lakes and things. I'm like, this is actually changing the atmosphere of the desert and adding humidity to an otherwise, it was, you know, it's bearable heat. People are like, oh, it's 115, but it's a dry heat and that kind of thing. Like, well, not
Yeah.
so much these days. Now it's getting increasingly moist. So yeah, that's a good example where, you know, the water and the desert, there's not, those don't have to be separate fields of study at all.
Yeah. I mean, I will just say, so there are over 200 golf courses in the Phoenix metro area.
Just within the
And
Phoenix metropolitan area. Wow.
yeah, and I mean, and it is wide, but we also don't have tons of water. I will also say that it's been told to me recently they don't use as much water as we think they do. But I do find it really, as somebody who grew up, I'm struck that we don't have this here in Arizona, but in El Paso, we would have watering days. So you could water everything on like Monday and Friday,
Hmm.
or like 2 to 3 days a week, you were allowed to water. And this was, you know, like a long time ago. And here we don't have that at all. It's kind of, if you can afford to pay for the water, you can use as much water as you want.
Right.
And I did once upon a time in the early stages of the dissertation when I was much more angry. I did want to take on all of the, I can't tell you how much it struck me when I moved here and saw these lakes in people's backyards, so that they could have boats. And I guess part of that is stemming from a lot of people who live here, who come from elsewhere.
Right.
We have a lot of people who move to the Phoenix area. And so, you know, that's something that they're familiar with, that they know, and that they want to have here too.
Yeah.
And there's no one, as far as I can tell, there's no one saying no. There's no one saying like, actually, that's not wise for the whole and for the future. And so that's, it's weird. I went on a bit of a tirade. I still maybe might do this project at some point in the future, but I wanted to do a fountain that didn't use water. I don't know what for a while I wanted to use sand, and a lot of my artist pals were like, you can't get sand to float, like it'll end, right? Like it will not. So we'll see, but conceptually it's nice, like a sand fountain, picture a sand fountain. Yeah. But I because all the apartment complexes, all of the fancy buildings, and there's tons of them here. It is a lot of urban sprawl out here, have fountains. That's like, it's a thing, and I see that, and I can't help it. And maybe that one fountain is not tons of water, but when I add like, okay, it's running 365 days a year, it's been here for this many years, and there's so many other buildings that are doing it, it is very overwhelming how much water is not being conserved.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a good one. Fountains are their own kind of hyper object. Like you see one, it's like, no, it's distributed. They're popping up all over the place.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah.
And I get it. There's this really lovely reminder, right? Like if you're in where we are, we're in a valley. We have the Salt River, but a lot of the urban sprawl, so like these towns like Gilbert and Chandler and now Santan Valley, and like there aren't a lot of there's a lot of fountains because there's not a lot of like trees and things like that. And so it's this nice room. You see flowing water in the desert, you feel, it's okay. We're not gonna like die of thirst, you know? Like
Right,
something
right.
about it, I get it's very placating. I can understand that on that level, but it does worry me that people are so content with the status quo, with the current status quo, and that more people aren't like, whoa, that's a waste of water.
Yeah.
I don't know. So that's a very personal opinion, obviously. But I want the fountains to go away. I don't know, maybe a light fountain. I don't know if that's any better because that's electricity.
That's a good point. If it's like a solar powered light fountain, it might be. I like the sand fountain one. That's tough.
It's tough, but one day, once the book is out and I'm like in my dotage, maybe I'll figure out how to do. Or maybe it'll just be all the fountains that are in Phoenix that has no water anymore, that are just overtaken with because we're in the future. So yeah. Anyways, I can like see there's no end. Like the desert stuff can go it can go post-apocalyptic.
That's true.
It can go any which way.
That's a good point. Yeah, there's a lot of or like sci-fi fantasy kind of stuff with deserts. I think like Dune.
Oh yeah,
that'd be a big one.
which is coming out soon.
Yeah.
Which is coming out soon.
That's true.
Yeah, I get asked probably the texts I get asked about the most are Desert Solitaire and Dune.
Oh,
like
interesting.
hands down. Those are the two I get asked about the most. And then maybe if whoever's asking me knows that I study the Borderlands as well, then they'll ask me about Gloria Anzaldúa, Borderlands, La Frontera. And those are at the top of the list. And so I'm trying to do my best to add others to the list too.
That's good. Yeah, it can't all just be Dune. We're like, oh, so Dune. Like, no, there's more out there.
And he was very, I mean, for what it's worth, Frank Herbert was very interested in like the science of how to undesert desert places. He was very interested in like, how do we manage this ecosystem and make it something it's kind of not. But yeah, there's plenty to be had. As you can see, I think part of it is getting past this initial notion of void or wasteland.
Yeah.
There's actually a really great book out by Aidan Tynan, who is at Cardiff University. So it's called The Desert in Modern Literature and Philosophy. And then my favorite part is the subtitle, which is Wasteland Aesthetics. And the problem is I always remember the subtitle and don't remember the title, the proper title, because I love this notion that he comes up with of wasteland aesthetics and how you find it throughout literature. This notion of this more abstract desert as wasteland. And so it is a really good book despite me blanking on the very first part of the title. So
Well, thanks for the recommendation. That sounds great. And a handful of good references, books, and some philosophers and things.
just
Whitehead came up.
peppermint.
Yeah, always good just to
Did you
say,
catch that?
yeah,
Whitehead.
kind of a quick Whitehead reference, like, oh, nice, nicely done. All the Whitehead scholars are like, oh, I'm tuning in now.
Yes, all 50 of you. No, I actually do. I love, I know that Deleuzians and Whiteheadians can coexist
Right, that's
and
true.
do.
Yeah,
But I love this notion, in Deleuze, you get the kind of radical immanence, which I love because I do, yeah, firmly believe in that, these emergent possibilities. And then, in Whitehead, you get this like process philosophy, right? And that is also its own set of emergences. And so I think they have both very much informed my own take on how I'm going to describe places that I believe are in themselves agential, right? And
right,
always creating the conditions for their own possibilities. So
right. Exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
that's true. Such great thinkers for trying to rethink agency and redistribute it so it's not just locked up in the human head or
yeah,
wherever people think agency is located.
wow, gotta get it out. I don't
Just let it
know.
out.
I think I've been like so ingrained with notions of like uh I don't know, agency means things have eyes, like from cartoons.
That's true.
But like I've been trying to do away with that. They do not have to have eyes. And I think, you said earlier in the podcast, you were talking about how people have been looking to like plants and vegetables, like how do we learn from them? And I think like fungi has been a big thing,
Right.
like mushrooms, right? So like Anna saying, looking to the way that these mushrooms flourish and bloom, and how they interact with their own ecosystems. Um, I don't know, that documentary, I don't know if you saw the documentary, that
Yes.
was my octopus teacher. Did
Yeah.
you see this documentary? So
So
like,
good.
it's so good. Now it's award winning.
Right.
But even before it was award winning, it was really good. And this man goes out there and essentially does really learn from the octopus and lets this octopus be the primary, I think, the primary agent of it all. He's just there and he's just learning. And so there is this wave that's happening where people are now are understanding the value in that. And I think what's striking to me is like, well, that's what a lot of indigenous cultures have been doing
Yeah.
around the world. And so it's interesting how those of us who are non-native have come at that and found that in a lot of ways through these. I mean, it's rock, right? Like Jeffrey Cohen has stone, like it's in, you're like learning from rock, you're learning from fungus, you're learning from whatever. And I think that, yeah, why not also try and apply that to desert places?
Yeah, exactly. Like, well, but it doesn't have eyes. And you're like, no, this either the fungi, but yeah, it's just the lowest rung. It's if you, like, read old texts where Christians are talking about idolatry, like, yeah, it's kind of idolatrous to worship an animal. It's extra idolatrous to worship a plant.
Oh,
Worshipping a
wow.
stone, just get out. Like, not even close. You're like, what
So
about the
there's a
desert?
hierarchy.
Yeah, it just gets worse and worse the more you move away from animals down the chain all the way to just sand. You're like, oh, absolutely not. A
No
forest,
way.
maybe,
I
not a
mean,
desert.
and that's interesting too, because there's a lot of things problematic about Heidegger, for example.
Right.
But he says something to the effect of a stone has no world, right? His
Right.
whole notion of worlding and being in the world. And so for worlding to happen, you need that like agency, right? You need that interaction. And for him, stones, forget it. They have
Yeah.
no world. They're not worth it. And I do very much disagree with that. I do believe stones have their, have their worlds, and
Yeah.
we can attune. This is a big word. Attunement is a big word that I try and employ in my work, but it's not just attunement. It aligns with distortion somewhat, right? Like it's not
Mm.
just attunement does not always equate this kind of like harmonious,
Right.
I don't know, like pananimism, harmonious, whatever. Attunement is kind of this ongoing, for me at least, is this ongoing negotiation and navigation with other than human, other humans. And it's a constant, right? Like it's always going to be changing. It is a process. I think thinking about attunement, retunement, detune, all the fun, like I said, I play with words a lot, but mixing that up like helps you understand those interrelationships better. And that's all we can ask for. I mean, as humanists,
Yeah.
even just as artists, like that's all we can ask for, is like understanding things better so that we can do things to make them better. And then better requires qualification, but like better for who?
Right.
And but that's important. And I think if you're doing that work, um keep going, right? I mean, that's maybe a note to myself, because I think I am doing that work and I do want to keep going. But I think that that's the power that humanities has, particularly environmental humanities, has with what we do. Like we do have that power to change people's perspectives on things,
Yeah.
and more so in some ways, on a very surface level, more so than someone who shows you a graph that you don't know how to parse,
Right.
right? That you don't know what's going on. And so it's kind of this, I'm hopeful that these interdisciplinary conversations that I've been allowed and encouraged to have at ASU, I'm hopeful and have seen that they're happening elsewhere. And I really do think that figuring that out has been really good for the academy, right? Like,
Yeah.
hey, we don't have to stay siloed. Like I asked you before we started this recording, right? Like I asked, like, I don't really study religion, right? Like, but as long as we know that, then it's okay. Like my limitation, and then I'll learn from you telling me about the hierarchy of everything from animal to plant to rock. And so then I learn and I take something away. And so I don't know, I just think that's the work we should be doing as humanists.
Nice. I really can't imagine a better note to end on. That's just great. That's exactly reflects my understanding of the environmental humanities, for sure. And the simple motto, right? Understand things better to make things better.
Yeah.
Then define better later, but still, that's
Yeah. Yes. There's always a footnote. It's the
yeah.
academy. There's always a footnote, right? Yeah. So,
Awesome. Well,
yeah.
geez, thanks so much for making time. It's really been a pleasure talking to you. And like I said, we'll already have to schedule something for the future once the book's out, and we'll do the book release
Of
party.
course. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. I appreciate you making space and sending the invite along. And I really hope that if anyone out there is interested in desert humanities, you can always give me a shout, at Twitter, my email, which I'm sure you'll provide somewhere. But
Yeah.
I'm always happy to talk deserts. And yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Celina Osuna. Thanks for being here, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. We'll be back next week with some more conversations for you. In the meantime, take care and be well.